All right, today we're going to be talking about streamlining your content operations in a fun way. Joining me today is Pamela Muldoon. She is the founding and principal strategy consultant at Content Leadership Advisory. Good to see you, Pamela.
Hello, Stephanie. Hello.
And Brody Dorland, who is the VP of Marketing at Litho. It's so good to have you here. Yay, everybody just
Happy to be here, Stephanie.
All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to you two, and I'll see you in just a little bit for some Q&A.
Sounds great. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. Pam and I have been friends and colleagues in the content marketing space for over a decade. I think we're probably going on 13, 14 years, something like that. And, every time we get together and we talk shop a lot, we swap war stories, we end up thinking to ourselves, we should have recorded this conversation. So we're finally getting our act together and documenting our ideas and turning them into content that hopefully will help content and creative teams work better together and create better content that moves the growth needle. So with all that said, today's discussion has a theme that is near and dear to both of our hearts. Both Pam and I love the TV show The Bear. I hope we have some Bear fans in the audience today. It is hands down one of the best TV shows out there. I love it to death. And the interesting thing is there's so many elements of the show that can be connected back to marketing. And not to bury the lead, but marketing functions. The marketing function today is high pressure. There's a need for constant collaboration. There are moments of chaos, leadership challenges. And there are tight deadlines to serve amazing content to our prospects and customers. So all these challenges and more are intensely explored in the show. And if you've watched the show, you know how intense it gets. Remember the fishes episode from season 2? Holy cow. That was interesting. Very intense for sure. So we have a lovely menu for you today. We're going to explore some non-negotiables. If you remember that from season 3, these are things that have to be present in order to be successful. We're going to talk about Misa and plots. We need to plan and prepare to ensure our day-to-day execution is on point. We're going to explore some change in the window. Obviously change is going to happen, but we can't let that derail our plan. Behind communication and feedback needs to be clear and actionable, so we don't get behind on our deadlines. And lastly, the family meal, where we reflect on what worked, what didn't, and make sure our executive leadership understands the value that we bring to the organization. Final note, if you haven't seen The Bear, I apologize now. This is your spoiler warning. We will be talking through a lot of things that happen in the show and how it relates to marketing. So hopefully everybody's seen the show and we won't be giving too much away, but this is definitely your spoiler warning. Okay, let's get started. So if you've watched the show, you remember from season 3 where Carmen creates a list of non-negotiables. Now, he did this largely because they wanted to elevate the quality level and experience of their new restaurant to the point where they would get a Michelin star. So, you can think of these things as the things they need to do to ensure that they hit that level of quality. And, I love this idea for marketing. If we want our companies to stand out, especially if we're working in highly competitive industries, we have to set high standards and then do everything we can to make sure our creative kitchens are aligned and, able to execute at that high level. So what would a marketing non-negotiables list look like? From my perspective, I would recommend all of these that you see listed here. So, we've got brand and messaging standards. So, this is our identities. Like every piece of content we design must be on brand, visually, tonally, strategically. Obviously, content and marketing strategy. Obviously, these are here, but when we think about that, every piece of content that we produce must serve a strategic purpose and align with business objectives. An audience-first approach, we cook for them. That's obviously a big part of it, and way too many companies are still too self-serving. Obviously, there's process and workflow things. We need to follow a structured workflow to maintain that efficiency and that quality. And then one of my favorites is this concept of razzle dazzle. This came about in season 3, where Richie was always, moments of joy for the customers. And I think this is really important, especially in today's age with AI, coming, to proliferation, where there's a good chance there's going to be a lot of just like commoditized crap content being produced by these AI tools. And so it's more important than ever. Like if you want to stand out, you really need to make an emotional connection, provide like unexpected value for your audiences, create those moments of joy. So I think, that might be another non-negotiable that, might be explored. When you think about, this list and, maybe gaps in your creative kitchen, Pam, I'm going to throw it to you. With your background in content operations and your vast experience working with so many different types of organizations, we look at this list. What do you feel like needs to be on everyone's list?
Well, Brody, I'm going to say all of them, right? But you kind of alluded to this before, and I think what's really important about taking a look at this list for those of you looking at the screen right now. So all 5 of these are critical, but the one that's missing or the gap that you have is probably the one that's most important right now, right? So if all of them are important, none of them are important in a way, but at the end of the day, all are important. So which one is missing? Now, the other thing to this is that depending on the size of your organization, that first one might be owned by a different part of the organization, maybe your PR, your communications department, which is happening in parallel to what you do in content, right? So we know this isn't always an apples to apples comparison with every size of the organization or team. But I will say that your strategy is so critical that if you don't have it, the rest really doesn't work. Okay. It's not that they don't matter. It just doesn't work. So that North Star, that strategy. And Brody, one of the things that I like to do is sometimes say, well, what does a content strategy, not having a strategy, actually sound like, right? So some of the ways that I've heard a non-existent strategy is we need a podcast, or we need to do more video, or I need to create a thing, insert thing here. We need an ebook for the campaign. We need a white paper for the campaign, right? Those are words and phrases that a lot of us hear, but that doesn't mean it's a strategic solution to something bigger. What's the North Star? What's the business objective? So I will always lean into strategy as the most important part of this entire process, but they're all pretty important. So when you don't have them, though, this is where misalignment starts to become an issue, right? When any of these are missing or if there's a gap. So misalignment, Brody. Nice image.
What, you don't want a really fancy corn dog?
No, looking pretty good. Looking pretty good.
Yeah. So let's see here. Next thing. So this leads us to kind of another area of focus, in this concept that was kind of introduced with the in the show. And if you're not familiar with this kind of French culinary concept, mise en place, it literally means everything in its place. And it speaks to the importance of preparation. In order to be successful in the restaurant world, you need to make sure all of your ingredients are properly prepared. You need to have all of your knives sharpened and, all of your pots and pans ready to go, all your dishes, all the things. And obviously everyone within the kitchen needs to know their roles and responsibilities. And, this actually translates really well to content and creative kitchens. You need to prep your campaigns and projects for success. So, Pam, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so I'm extremely passionate about preparing. There's great tools at our fingertips, such as the one that Litho provides, but without preparing ahead of time, a tool is only as good as the input you provide, right? So documenting your workflow and process. And of course, this means in the bare land, bringing in all your cooks for alignment. That will help with the misalignment that's happening. One of the areas of workflow versus, it's what I call workflow versus tasks. Okay, so I'm a big believer that content teams really need to be focusing on an editorial type way to look at what they do, not just from an editorial calendar, right? You've got a calendar that's pushed out 30 days, 90 days, et cetera, but even from a workflow process. So for example, there are tasks to be done, But if they're in a project management type of setting, it can be really challenging, especially if the task becomes more critical than the workflow or what comes, the steps that happen before the tasks need to be done. Perfect example I've had in my past is the social media images need to get done on X date, but we haven't even finished the content piece yet, right? So there's a misalignment of when tasks need to be done, and workflow really does help us get there, but it is so extremely critical that you take the time. I like to refer to it as taking a step back to move 2 steps forward. And it's an area that most organizations, especially with the challenges all of you are facing right now, limited budgets, just lack of resources when it comes to human, maybe you've had budget cuts, things like that, team cuts. So how do you do all this? And it's really honestly taking that step back to document every single part of your workflow so that you understand who does what, who's responsible for what. And then that really does drive into these other pieces so much more successfully, such as campaign design and intake. So Brody, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, and I was even going to call back to the non-negotiables piece. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, here's all these things that we need to be doing, but oftentimes that is not necessarily viewed as like revenue generating work. And so it's hard for companies or even teams, leaders to have the time to take that step back, think about those things, go through those exercises. And I think the you know, things like campaign and project templates, that's all part of that. You know, I've got a few examples on this front. You know, if you've got if you're regularly doing things like events or webinars, or you know you've got a lot of demand gen campaigns that you're doing on a regular basis, you know, things like case studies, whatever that is, having that whole process, whether it's probably a combined set of workflow and tasks, having that fully laid out in a system that's templatized. So every time you need to start a new one, you already have all of that baked in, and you could just say, okay, start new, and you write in some of the details, and boom, there's your whole process. Like that's obviously, you know, a really nice kind of holy grail situation to be in. Another example that we recently did, we really did a lot of work last year. You know, we're constantly, as a software tool, we're always coming out with new features and new tools and those kinds of things. And so our product marketing manager, her name's Sarah, she did a ton of awesome work just to lay out the process and all of the deliverables that we need to have ready for the different tiers of product features and things that we would roll out. It's literally a 3-tier system, top tier being a big feature that we want to do a big splash, versus something smaller, might maybe a tier 3 that only has a few deliverables associated to it. And when you can map all of that out in a tool that you know literally spells out the entire workflow, all of the tasks, man, it makes that whole process so much easier. Now, there's that full process, but even at the beginning, the requests that come in, it's such a big part of it, and I'm sure you have many stories to speak on related to this.
Yes, because everybody has an idea, right? There's always the ideas. It's not for lack of ideas. It's always, how do you implement? How do you get this going? So this is really for those of you that are still struggling with getting all of your intake via email or Slack or Teams or any of these wonderful tools that are not designed as a content intake form, but where we get a lot of our communications with our fellow stakeholders and team members. And I don't want to take away from those moments, right? It's not about taking away from those, but it's about redesigning and just kind of relooking at how organizational really make for not only less chaos in the kitchen, if you will, but also for better output. So the idea of making more of a formalized intake request process, and of course, software systems that allow this are critical, but it's also, I think, one of the key areas that folks in content are either hesitant to make a formal intake process is because then it lacks or it stops the opportunity for communication or ideation, brainstorming. And that couldn't be further from the truth, to be perfectly honest. So I've, in my previous positions, or as I consult with companies that are looking to improve intake, it's about creating an intake process that gets the ball rolling in a system, in a systematic way, to ensure everybody's ideas get to the table. And the intake process is usually the first step of, now let's set up the call or the meeting to talk about it and brainstorm it. The other reason intake is so critical, other than not missing ideas that are important, is it kind of changes who's in control of the process a little bit. Okay. When you're getting Slack messages, when you're getting emails from others, they're kind of putting their monkey on your back, right? Yeah. Their monkey is now on your back. So you've got to deal with it, as opposed to if you had a more formal intake process that you encouraged and empowered your team to push out. Information is consistently input. Now you can set up the next call, the next meeting, the next step of that workflow. And I'm telling you, just that simple mindset shift can be empowering for a content team.
Yeah. And, we know that there's plenty of ways that this whole thing can be derailed if you don't have that process in place. I love this stat. It essentially tells a troubling tale of the reality inside many marketing departments. Less than 30% of marketers say creatives follow a brief well, while less than 25% of creatives think marketers provide a strong kickoff details. So, yikes. And if you've watched the Bear, you probably remember this particular scene. Major breakdowns in communication were happening between these two, and there was definitely tension. We recently published a new case study at Litho with one of our customers. The guy's name was Bob, and he was kind of head of creative for a company called Sun & Ski. They're a big retailer. And he mentioned one of kind of the quotes that we pulled into the case study was he was talking about we have no accountability, or we had no accountability prior to bringing us on. And he said, if you tell one of my designers to get something done just because you walked by her, it's just an idea. It's not a request. So yeah, really important to formalize that as much as you can, and kind of understand that process. Speaking of tension, as we plan and prep our processes and load up our content calendars with campaigns and content initiatives, curveballs are going to get thrown at us. Pam, with all of the different types of companies that you've worked with over the years, what is your advice, as far as navigating change, when curveballs are thrown at you?
Yeah. And they're going to happen, right? Every single one of us are going to deal with this. You cannot not have it. I mean, perfect world. You start with your plan, you implement, and you have the output. And it was always the same thing from beginning to end. Never going to happen, right? So first and foremost, one of the first things to think about change is you cannot change what you have if you don't know where you are currently. The only way to change is to know current state. That's why workflow, getting it written, documented, is critical. And once you have those, and it's kind of manual, right? But it's a process where you have it all workflowed out, managed out. The reason it's also important is because of what I like to refer to as the 80-20 rule. Many of you may have heard of this. It's also known as the Pareto principle. It's an actual kind of principle or rule created by an Italian engineer back in the 1900s that basically states that 80%, that 80% of consequences come from 20% of the causes. And yet you can use it in almost every formula, time management process, everything. How I like to use it with workflow and process, if I have everything outlined, life happens, right? We have now someone who needs a gluten-free item on the menu that we need to change or make change. When you already know your process, 20% of it can be adjusted, pivoted, modified, and it won't cause as much anxiety, stress, chaos, and tension. The plan is actually to plan for the 20%, right? It just makes it so much more, doable, and you can almost expect the change to happen. So I really lean into the 80-20 rule, but the only way, guys, as a reminder, is you got to get that process documented so you can actually shift, pivot, modify that 20%. Okay?
Yeah. And I also often think of the difference between big change and small changes. There's obviously big change examples like and I'll throw out a real world example that we're dealing with right now. We had a very busy schedule. Our content calendar is full. There's a lot going on right now inside of our organization, but we just won a big award from G2, and we want to shout from the rafters that we just won this award. We want to do a whole campaign around it. Well, we gotta move some things around to make to fit that in. Now, to your 80-20 point, if we've got only 80% of our plan completely baked and we've left some room, it's probably not a big lift to throw that new campaign into the mix. But if we are 100% already baked and we haven't left ourselves any room, gosh, what has to bump? And someone has to make that decision. We got to figure out what moves. Just having to deal with that on a regular basis. It's so important to think about that 80-20 rule. And so I love that. But obviously there's also small changes, even individual changes to documents, to assets you're producing right now, and making sure that there's a good environment for being flexible and adaptable to those changes as well. Now, obviously, the right platform can help here. When you have implemented a process tool that is tailored to the creative process, things like change request functions, these should already be baked in. Now, when a major change happens at a project level, I can submit a change request form and communicate and document the change right within a project. Now, if changes need to be made on an individual asset, having a good proofing tool, to be able to annotate right on a document, within the asset is really helpful. Now, of course, you can do all this stuff manually, but it can turn into chaos real quick. So this brings up one of the biggest issues that we've been working to solve at Litho for the last few decades. Think about it this way, how often does this happen in your world? You're trying to create a content asset, get it out the door, but there are too many cooks in the kitchen and there's conflicting feedback. Let's say you really need to get a particular stakeholder to review an asset, but they've gone MIA. Or the feedback you've received is unclear and now you're on version number 17. Can anybody resonate with any of that? Does that happen on a daily basis? I'm sure many of you, it probably does. Now, obviously, it's really hard for content and creative teams to be successful and hit deadlines without a structured review and approval process in place. And I hope everyone on this call has something in place. But if you don't, we'd certainly love to talk to you. A few key elements that I want to call out in this process when we think about getting clear feedback in order to create faster approvals. When you think about a particular content asset, what is the route that it has to go through to get approval? Who needs to sign off on it? Is there a certain order in which you need to kind of route that piece through your process? It's really nice when you have these routes templatized. So, you can load your asset, choose the route, and go. It's really nice to have that. And then secondly, how are changes communicated? Are you still marking up Word documents, Google documents, PDFs, those kinds of things? Or hopefully you're working yourselves into a more sophisticated solution that allows you to annotate changes directly on the document itself. And this could be any kind of asset, from Word docs to text-based documents to graphics to videos, all of those kinds of things. Hopefully you have something like that in your kit. If you don't, again, we're here. When you do have the right tool in place, this gives you so much structure out of the box and, centralizes the entire process. And hopefully you can, have some reporting as well. And I really just kind of want to, tying it back to the bear, you remember how much of a dramatic change they went through over those seasons. They went from, making sloppy sandwiches to Michelin star cuisine. Spoiler warning. The right processes and tools are the way that help to get you there. So let's talk about the family meal, Pam.
Yes. So for us, in the restaurant business, and it was brought forth in the bear really nicely, was the family meals, of course, where the members of the kitchen, the staff come together for a meal before the shift starts, right? And usually one cook, the sous chef, or somebody is in charge of the family meal. It's also a time to reflect what's working, what's not working. It's also a time to think, what can we do differently, right? So how can we use that analogy into our world as content? One of the areas you do that is by taking whatever it is you're doing and have some type of reporting, reflect, and improvement process. And we are in a tough situation as content creators and those that develop content. Much of the time, if not most or the majority of the time. When we talk about data, KPIs, statistics, they are driven towards a revenue generating model, which is great. They should be. So your demand gen team, they might have access to the email reports, or sales enablement has access to some of their conversion, their MQLs, SQLs, all the things, right? They have that all in place. One of the challenges is we as content producers don't always get the credit where content is successful or not, right? So even defining what success is really challenging for us. How well did that piece of content work? Did it work? Being able to have a function that is somewhat yours between you and your content and creative team, just simply looping them in, right? Looping content and creative in together to be able to talk about what it is you're doing, having some internal metrics and performance reports. I call it production ROI, production return on investment. So we are given the adage of getting all of these things done, but if we don't know what we're doing, how long it takes, what kind of expense is involved, it's really hard to keep our budgets in place and our people in place year after year. So by actually having your systems documented and in a tool that allows you to report what your SLAs are, to report how much time it took to do the blogs, how much time it took to do the ebooks, et cetera, you now have actual numbers and data that you can modify, change, pivot, work with. You can reflect and improve. This is real money to somebody in the organization. If you can decrease your service level agreements or your SLAs, improve efficiency and workflow, your production return on investment is a real number that you can actually attach as part of your KPIs and data. And so I am a big, big believer in having the ability to pull forward this information so that you as a team can actually have some control over what it is you're able to provide from, go move out of the expense column, if you will, into more of a part of the revenue conversation. Which actually brings us to kind of where we are here at the end. These 5, areas that we talked about, or the areas that we've shared with you today. Now, there is a lot. I'm right there with you. Content development, content performance, content planning, content strategy, governance, taxonomy. There is so much, and I know it can feel overwhelming. So we want you to really think of taking one of these processes and figuring out a way to connect with your team. And your team does not necessarily mean just your content team, right? This is your creative team, the stakeholders in different departments, maybe in demand gen, product marketing, customer marketing, sales enablement. Who else do you need to be having conversations with? And maybe it's about setting your non-negotiables. What are the things you will never, ever put up with not having? What is that list like Carmen had? What is that list that's a non-negotiable to you so that you can do the good work you're set to do? Maybe it's all about improving your project preparation. Campaign templates, for example. What are you doing ahead of time? What are you doing to prepare ahead of time? If you're doing a lot of things over and over again and you've never documented them or trained them, that's a big red flag. That is an area for improvement. And then managing change without chaos. Again, I'm a big believer. You cannot move forward with change if you don't know where you are today. So make sure your processes, your workflows are defined so that the tools you use can be used to help you kind of calm the chaotic waters, if you will. And then feedback. I used to work in the restaurant business. I was a wait person. I'm not even sure what we called it back in the day. But if you didn't say, not only behind, but sometimes it was door, right, or left or right, whatever the case is, right? Clear and actionable feedback and information is critical. Here's the thing, guys, as you develop your systems, process, et cetera, the idea is that they need to be pliable once you test them. Once the communication starts, the feedback allows you to improve. And that's where the good stuff really happens, which then brings it to measure and reflect. As I mentioned, I personally believe content teams have the capability to put production return on investment in play. And I want you to be able to have a bigger, better, brighter seat at the table when it comes to budget, who does what, and the strategic conversations you're having. So make sure your data can prove out some of the ways that you're actually making positive change from an expense to a revenue as well. Okay.
Love it. Love it. So quick wrap up here. Obviously, we wanted to do this webinar and try to throw as much of this at you in a very tight time frame as possible. But certainly, as you're thinking about the tools that you guys are using, we have a great one, a whole suite of tools that provide a lot of the functions that we talked about today. But I won't go any farther on that. I'll just go ahead and bring Stephanie back in for a little bit of Q&A.
All right, fantastic. That was really great. Love the slides. Love them. Okay, we are pretty much out of time, so we're going to do a little rapid fire Q&A. Let's pretend like we're in the kitchen. Okay, Jessica wants to know, how do you effectively manage competing interests within an organization, particularly when faced with the perception that everyone can do marketing? I know we've all heard that. For instance, how do you handle situations where another department is eager to publish content that might not really align with your strategic objectives? Sounds like a non-negotiable to me, doesn't it? Yeah. What do you think?
Yes. Short answer. Behind. Yes.
Yeah. I can take a little bit of this, Brody. You can go ahead and jump in, if you want to. But basically, first of all, Jessica, I hear you and I feel your pain. I don't think there's a single content person or team member that hasn't been in your shoes per se. The challenge that I'm also hearing in this question is, where's the strategic coming from? Where is that North Star, right? So the other departments should also be working from the same North Star. And this is where leadership needs to kind of take a stronger role in making sure everyone's on the same page. I know that's not super helpful with how do you make it happen. At the same time, the majority of folks inside an organization want to be heard, right? They just simply want to be heard. And much of the time when you have similar, same type of content that needs to get done, you're also trying to eliminate the redundancy factor. So being able to prove out that we've done this before, we've got this, can we just 80-20 this piece of content so it's slightly different but works for the customer team versus the demand gen team, whatever the case is, opening up that door for conversation. I know it's hard, but it's not about saying no. It's about saying, okay, I hear you. Let's see what we can do so that we're all on the same strategic page. And then, of course, you may have to tap a leader to come in and kind of actually empower the no, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Excellent. Well said. Okay, Lauren has too many cooks in the kitchen. She's acknowledging here in her question. She's asking, essentially, when you're dealing with approaches that are in conflict. You've got legal approvals that have to be done. You've got engineering input. You're hearing from different parts of the organization. This can interfere with an audience first approach or the razzle dazzle, right? How do you reconcile that without losing the message or the momentum?
Yeah, that's tricky, especially if the feedback or the influences you're getting are very strong, which I'm sure they are. That's why they're the cooks. And I think there has to be, again, I go back to the non-negotiables. I go back to the strategy. There has to be alignment there, and sometimes you do have to get in a room with all of these people and talk it out. And you might have the asset that went through the review phase, and there's all these comments that are conflicting, and you can't necessarily expect maybe the creative who initially did it to figure out, okay, well, I'm getting very much conflicting things here. Sometimes you literally just have to hop on a call and talk through it, and make sure that you have a really good understanding what was the ultimate strategy of this particular asset. Does this feedback align with that? And almost your strategy becomes that backboard that you really need to have to make sure that every piece of feedback is kind of bounced off of it, and ultimately come to a decision that everybody can live with.
Right. Yeah. What was the last recommendation you had? It was measure and reflect. In this reflection time, it would be a good time to talk about, hey, we missed the boat on the audience first experience here. Right. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one more here, and I realized we could probably do another 30 minutes just on this question, but how do you measure success for a campaign that you've been preparing? What are your favorite measures?
Oh boy.
Well, the campaign involves so many micro KPIs, right? So first and foremost, before you can answer that question, one of the first conversations you should be having is, what is the definition of success for this campaign? Okay. So those answers should be actually in play before you start the first piece of content, before you start the first email copy, before you start the first graphics for social media, right? So that you know exactly what the main objective is to increase our conversion by XYZ, whatever. Maybe that's the big North Star for this campaign, but then you're going to have many micro conversions, open rate, conversion from whatever you're doing on social to whatever the case, right? So you're going to have many conversions, but they should have at least one answered. And I think the other element that gets really challenging here is having too many objectives for a campaign. You don't want to have probably more than one or two at the most. Like, what is your intent? And then all the micro conversions should actually line up to that one question or that one objective for the campaign, which is answered before you start.
Yep.
That helps.
Couldn't have answered that any better.
Yeah, fantastic. Really appreciate it. Hey, folks, we are out of time. There are some other really great questions in here. I promise you we're going to get answers for you. Okay, I'm going to share these with Pamela and Brody, and we'll make sure we get answers. So thank you for your wonderful questions and being so engaged in today's event.